Good morning, everyone. This is a video lecture on William Zinsser's bits and pieces from his book on writing well. The central assertion of Zinsser's chapter Bits and Pieces is one that he makes in respect to punctuation, specifically the period. Zinsser writes that, quote, "There's not much to be said about the period except that most writers don't reach it soon enough." Within that statement, we find a belief that is important to the entire book and is central to Zinsser's discussion of good writing in this chapter. Zinsser advises the writer most strongly to get out of his or her own way. Instead of doing too much work ourselves, Zinsser argues in favor of the way that we can use words, oftentimes those very words that we've already written, to do the work that they were already meant to do, instead of meddling in it ourselves. There are many different focuses in this chapter, and I don't have time to mention them all here, but I will be discussing the ones that are the most relevant to our writing in this course. These focuses start with verbs. Remember, these are action words. The English language has as its first main focus what is happening. The center of any good sentence is the verb and the thing doing that verb. Zinsser's advice to us is in keeping with that fact. Use active, simple verbs so that they are able to move sentences forward in ways that are self-evident to the reader, whoever he or she is. So important is our selection of clear evocative verbs that Zinsser advises us to leave adverbs or describing words about verbs out entirely. He says, whenever we can, that we should not say things like the radio blared loudly because, of course, blare connotes loudness. A simple relationship exists for Zinsser between nouns and adjectives. A carefully chosen noun is usually one that conveys something of the description of the thing along with the thing itself. Here Zinsser writes, quote, "The rule is simple. Make your adjectives do the work that needs to be done," and I want to make sure that we put an emphasis here on needs to be done. This is in contrast to work that is unnecessary, either because the noun is already evocative of its description, the way that a reader will know the color and texture of the local dirt or green of the grass outside his or her window, or because the description simply isn't essential to the larger point being made. And this would be a real problem because it would lack both relevance and also any place in the writing itself because it doesn't need to be there. A final point offered up in this first section of the chapter, which has to do with how what we add to writing has the potential to take away from its power, has to do with what Zinsser calls little qualifiers. These are phrases like a bit, kind of, rather, quite, very, to, pretty much, in a sense, and lots of others. Every single addition of any such little qualifier only chips away at the authority of what we seek to say. Zinsser writes, quote, "Don't hedge your prose with little timidities." He goes on to say, "Good writing is lean and confident." The same way an anxious mood might lead us to talk too much and give ourselves away by saying too little in the end, such qualifiers have the same effect on the person we present just behind the words we write as we write them. The chapter's punctuation advice says, essentially, that we must use punctuation in ways that correspond to how we want to sound and seem to the reader. The faster we reach the period in a sentence, the more direct and honest we are. The more we use exclamation points, the more we trivialize ourselves and what we say about our subject. Semicolons slow down the pace of our writing. They serve to cancel out the momentum we have already built up. Dashes can be used to build that momentum back up again, by their nature pushing the sentence ahead from thought to thought. Colons are simple and functional, the best ways to lead into lists. Zinsser then moves on to a discussion of mood changers. These are the sorts of words we've probably been taught about before as transitions, and while they are helpful in linking ideas together in the writing process, they are more important tools that communicate to the reader that there has been, or will be, a shift in the writing that they are about to encounter. We do the reader a necessary service by using a mood changer to start a sentence which shifts directions from the previous one. Meanwhile, if we do the reader no such favor, we run the serious risk of that reader getting lost. We know from previous discussions that there are only so many times the reader will go back and go to the trouble of finding where they were before they get tired of making the effort and simply stop reading, and that's the biggest danger. Other points in the section include the directive to use the same sorts of contractions that normally occur to us in speech. These include things like it's, I'm, can't, won't, etc., because these help us to sound natural and warm. This is as opposed to the sort of contraction to avoid using whose meanings are unclear, such as I'd, he'd, or we'd, or which have been invented for the sole purpose of shortening writing, but which are not as common in speech, like could've. Along the same lines, and in the interests of not sounding affected, Zinsser also considers the question of whether to use that or which, and recommends that wherever possible, unless it would result in ambiguity. Zinsser does share some examples of statements that would benefit from which, such as the house, which has a red roof, and the store, which is called Bob's Hardware. But personally, I would just shorten those further to the house with a red roof or the store called Bob's Hardware. You know me by now, I really like to use as few words as possible. Though the section that explicitly has to do with rewriting doesn't come until much later, quite a few of the next considerations in bits and pieces fit into the category of rewriting well. These include credibility, dictation, the quickest fix, and paragraphing. Credibility comes on the heels of overstatement, a consideration that is not essential for us here. But the point is that Zinsser says, if the reader catches us making a bogus claim, such as through needless overstatement or other carelessness, that reader will begin to doubt everything else we say. The point is true for pretty much any time a reader catches a writer trying to pass off dishonest discussion. But what is important here is that there are ways we might fall into that trap in the misguided spirit of making our writing more interesting, when instead we simply make it harder to believe. In a slightly different spirit, that of making our writing quicker and more fluid, Zinsser addresses the inclination to write through dictation. This part of the discussion is even more current than some others, as we have apps such as Google Docs with its voice typing feature that are completely free, can be used on a phone, tablet, laptop, or any other device with a microphone. I will admit to being intrigued by this myself until I tried it. Zinsser advises that writing this way usually ends in writing that lacks personality and soul. I agree with him. I found that between the lack of sentence structure in writing we do this way and the amount of simple editing necessary to make dictated writing readable, everything sounded generic and boring in the end. The last two considerations from bits and pieces that I will discuss here as part of the rewriting process are the quickest fix and paragraphing, and I tend to think of these things as being more closely connected than Zinsser seems to. The quickest fix asserts, simply, that when there is an idea or bit of writing that just won't work, we're usually best advised to cut it and work from that point. Oftentimes, that bit of writing wasn't working because it wasn't necessary, or because we got so caught up in trying to fix it that we couldn't see the forest for the trees. That is, we got so caught up in fixing it that we didn't realize it wasn't necessary to have it there. The other thing that oftentimes we gain by simply getting rid of the problem is that we usually notice that a much more simple solution was there all along. Now, all these things are true, and I wish someone had told me about these things a long time ago. I would have spent less of my life fussing over writing that wasn't going to work in the first place. In terms of how this approach to dealing with persistent problems has to do with paragraphing, often when the problem goes beyond a few words to a few sentences or more, which refuse to work well despite our best efforts, it's best to cut those sentences from the paragraph they started in and paste them into a new one. Often, those sentences refuse to play by the rules because they didn't fit into the paragraph we are trying so hard to shoehorn them into. Regardless of where the paragraph came from, though, whether its beginnings were as the result of a few lines that refused to fit into their original location or otherwise, Zinsser's advice is clear. Keep them short and see them for what they are, a device for managing reader expectations. A short paragraph seems manageable to look at, and its main point is much easier to trace for its short length. A long paragraph is intimidating to look at, its logic hard to follow, and main point often nebulous or even unrecognizable by the paragraph's end. This last possibility marks another of the greatest reader lossage risks to be considered. A reader who can't see how the last sentence of the long paragraph has anything to do with the first one This person usually sees static and feels only pain behind his or her eyes when faced with having to read it all again. There may be no better way of expressing the last thing a reader wants their writing to do to their reader than causing them physical pain. Thanks.